Today's forum is the first annual Carol Maguire Legacy Forum, made possible by a generous donation to establish a CMC Legacy Fund at the Columbus Foundation. Please help me thank Carol. We also enjoy support today from OSU Urban Art Space and the Greater Columbus Arts Council in partnership with the Columbus Association for the Performing Arts. Please help me thank them also. Over the years, CMC has had the opportunity to include theater in our programming mix. Each occasion has been a rare chance to experience world-class drama up close and get to know the players on a personal level. Today, we're going back to 1916. 1916 is a year of turmoil. It's also the 100th year anniversary of Ireland's Easter Rising. During 1916, we were in the middle of World War I with the battles of Gallipoli, Verdun, and the Somme. The Mexican Revolution was taking place, the murder of Rasputin and the beginning of the Russian Revolution was starting, the creation of the Kingdom of Poland, the growth of the women's suffrage movement around the world. Einstein completed his general theory of relativity, and the Easter Rebellion in Ireland. Today, we are thrilled to host our international guests from Abbey Theatre, the National Theatre of Ireland, on the occasion of this 100th anniversary of Ireland's 1916 Easter Rising. Regarded as a masterpiece, The Plough and the Stars is a provocative play that provides a glimpse of the political culture of Ireland at a seminal moment in history. Now, let's learn more about the culture, art, and significance of our Irish friends, allies, and kin from our speakers. Please welcome Director of the Abbey Theatre, Neil Murray. Associate Director of the Plough and the Stars, Ronan Phelan. I'm sorry, that's Phelan, and he told me that, so I apologize. The Acting Consul General of Ireland to the Midwest, Ragnar Almquist. The Director of Public Affairs and Advancement of the Abbey Theatre, Oonagh Desire. And our host and producing director of CATCO, Stephen Anderson. Stephen?
Hi. Excuse me. I was told that I was to keep things lively today, but after sitting at this table for lunch, I don't think I need to do anything but stand back. This is a lively bunch, and I think you're going to enjoy yourselves. I would like to, if you haven't seen The Plough and the Stars, would like a spoiler alert: everybody dies. At any rate, the play was written about a specific time. And this production is much more modern. But I think it would be great if one of you could give us a little bit of background about, I don't know, what's it, 600 years of oppression?
Oh, background about the oppression?
Yeah. Just to...
Wow. So the background about the moment in which the play is set?
Why the uprising occurred.
Oh, okay. Well... yeah, there was 600 years of oppression, ba-boom. I suppose it came out of a movement that started in the late 19th century, so the late 1800s, in which there was what's known as the Celtic Revival, so a revival of and an investment in the Irish language, the GAA, the origin of the GAA, which is the Gaelic Athletic Association, kind of a movement to bring Irish back to schools, and through all of these kind of cultural, social, and educational developments, there was a resurgence in the movement to get Irish control over their own kind of affairs. Please correct me, because I'm definitely editorially broadly correct. Let's go with it. Broadly is good. So and then. Where was I going with that? So the movement at the time politically was moving towards a thing called home rule, which meant that there would be a certain amount of power, political power, that would be kind of outsourced to Dublin from Westminster. And it was kind of on track for that to happen, but then the First World War began in 1914, and Home Rule was kind of, they put a pause on the bill essentially for all non-essential bills. They put a pause on it, and so out of the growing frustration with the pause, more kind of fundamental nationalists thought that this was an opportunity to, while England was looking the other way, essentially.
England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity.
Yeah, exactly.
So, to some degree.
So basically, we took advantage of the fact that England was looking towards Germany to attempt an uprising in 1916. I mean, I think it was always. I think that the leaders of the uprising were always aware of its kind of theatrical significance, in the sense that its gestural significance, much more than its military kind of prowess or its actual ability to overthrow the British army. But they were aware that the gesture, the sacrifice, because there was a lot of talk of blood sacrifice at the time, of the men who would be involved with it, would do a lot to stir and generate the nationalist movement, which they felt had been slightly had relapsed slightly with the kind of advent of Home Rule, or the potential advent of Home Rule.
I think something that's a very good synopsis that's worth bearing in mind contextually as well is that many Irish nationalists who were fervent advocates of Home Rule also participated, as you mentioned, in those battles, most notably the Battle of the Somme, and very many Irish lives were lost in that, fighting on the part of the British Army. And indeed, that's been one of the fantastic elements of this year of commemoration in Ireland, and very much a part of the Abbey programme, is to look at the totality of experience on the island of Ireland. And I think, along with the Plough and the Stars, one of the other fantastic Irish plays which has been performed over the last year is by Northern Irish playwright Frank McGuinness, Observe the Sons of Ulster marching towards the Somme, and it tells the story in particular of Ulster volunteers within the British Army. So it was quite a complex time. It's always complex in Ireland, I suppose. But there
was a lot of contradiction kind of colliding.
What I find really interesting is I'm a Welshman, but nobody's perfect. I'm a Welshman who's just had the privilege of taking over the directorship of the Abbey, having really worked all my professional life in Scotland. So my Celtic credentials are impeccable. But what I find really interesting about both the Plough and the Stars and the whole story of the Rising, of course, is that from the outside, I think, certainly when you live in Britain, you think that the Rising is seen as the moment when Ireland gets independence, and of course it isn't. Yeah. That the Rising fails in a sense and is suppressed. And what struck me, and I'd be interested from my Irish friends if this is true, that what really turned things around was not so much the Rising itself, but the execution of the leaders of the Rising, and the sense that if the British hadn't have executed them and had just maybe imprisoned them quietly, things may not quite. The martyrdom is really what spurred things forward, up to 22. Is that a fair assumption?
I think so. I mean, the Rising lasted 6 days, and militarily was a spectacular failure in all respects. But as you said, the detention in Kilmainham jail of the signatories of the Irish Proclamation and their subsequent execution through the month of May, and it was somewhat staggered as well, so that a sense of particular unease and distress kind of permeated across the country, and that led kind of renewed impetus to the blood sacrifices, as Pearse might have described it, that the signatories of proclamation had given, and really spurred the movement and the push for independence again. And ultimately then, I said it's 6 days of the Rising. It was 6 years later, ultimately, that Ireland became an independent free state. But it was very much on the back of the reaction to 1916, and particularly the executions.
And
this production,
most of Ireland.
Right. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Most of Ireland became
right.
Well, this is true.
Right. This production, though, is built in a much more modern kind of way.
Yeah.
So could you talk to that, Ronan?
I suppose the aesthetic of the show, although we haven't changed the language of the play at all, and the edits are minimal to the text, the aesthetic of the show is quite contemporary. The reason that choice was made, I think, is that the play was written in 1925, and although it's about 1916, I think it's much more the subject of the play really is about the gap between those two dates. I think that O'Casey, in calling it, I mean, I was always confused as to why it was called The Plough and the Stars, to be honest with you, before I actually went and studied the play. And I also had a slightly lazy idea that it was a nationalistic play. I think because of its association, it being the jewel in the crown of the Abbey Theatre, and it having such a close connection with Irish nationalism and with the Irish cause, and it being so heavily involved with that, I always assumed that it was some sort of kind of pro-nationalist play. And actually, it's completely the opposite. It's an excoriating piece, which tears at Ireland and really demands that it look at itself. And so he's using the opportunity of a decade or nearly a decade on from this seminal moment, which was the turning point in leading up to Ireland's independence and Ireland having the opportunity to define itself as a country. That he's going back to that moment and saying, you know, at this point in time there was choice. You know, we had a few roads that we could go down, and we've chosen one. And is it the right one? Because, you know, the Plough and the Stars as a flag at the time represented socialism, communism, equality, and certainly equality for the working man. And in fact, by the time we get to 1925, the tricolour is the flag of Ireland. And so the story of the Plough and the Stars, broadly speaking, is the story of that flag. By the end of the play, the flag is dead. The opportunity for the Socialist Republic of Ireland is gone. And, you know, they've decided that it's, you know, the country that it was becoming in 1925 was much more heavily conservative, was strongly engaged and in kind of hand in glove with the Catholic Church, and a lot of the kind of the fervent bubbling of opportunity that one felt or one senses around 1915, 1916, and indeed kind of from the decade up to 1916. Dublin feels like very contemporary, very culturally vibrant, very permissive and liberal capital, that by the time we get to 1925, it is a much more rigid place, which, I mean, as reflected by the riots to the play itself, which is clamping down on expressions of doubt or inquiry into the idea of Ireland, as in the idea of Ireland has been consolidated, and what we have to do is get behind it now and stop asking questions. So I think the reason why people rioted is because O'Casey had the guts, really, at such a tender point in Ireland's development, to kind of rip the plaster off and say, no, we should really have a look at what we're doing here. So the reason why it's contemporary, sorry, to go back to the question, oh God, to go back to the question, we took as the jumping off point that, okay, so this play is not just about 1916, it's about the gap between when it was written and 1916. And so therefore, it's incumbent upon us to make our production about the gap between 2016 and 1916. And the primary context for the play, which is not discussed because who discusses it when they're living it, is poverty. So we really wanted to try and articulate the poverty of the people at the time in a way that was immediately resonant for a contemporary audience. So all of the clothes are, you know, polyblend and like bad jeans. People drink cans. They drink spirits out of the bottle, like they smoke a lot. The lifestyle that we wanted to try and capture was one of contemporary poverty, rather than the danger of a sort of romantic or nostalgic poverty of shawls and babies. And so, you know, that in itself, particularly in Ireland, has become a slightly seductive image in which, God, we were poor and we'd no teeth, but we were great crack, you know?
But what was important about this production, and especially because Ronan talked about the danger of seeing the Plough and the Stars as one of Ireland's heritage pieces, was the then director of the Abbey offered the play to a theatre director called Sean Holmes. Sean's an Englishman living in London, had never seen the play, had never read the play. He got an offer to see if he might be interested in taking it and making the National Theatre of Ireland's centenary production. He read the script and went, I'm in. So that was a bold move. When it was announced, there were a few eyebrows raised in Ireland, but I think when you see the show, you'll see he was exactly the right man for the job.
Yeah, and I'd say, I mean, again, to contextualise, the Abbey production is part of I think it's called Waking the Nation, which is sort of the Abbey's contribution to the commemoration of 1916. And that in itself is part of what we've had in Ireland. You never do things by halves. A decade of centenaries that stretches from 1912 and the signing of the Ulster Covenant right the way through to 1922. I was going to just come back to the point you make about the Plough and the Stars as a flag, because that was my experience as well. I hadn't really realised its origins, but I found a nice quote from O'Casey, which I thought I might just briefly read. It says, "Ireland, what a curious country. No other nation in the world has had so many national flags, so many national anthems, so many names. We've had the green flag with the harp, the green flag with the sunburst, the flag hypothetic of St. Patrick's Cross, the blue flag with the 3 golden crowns, and the tricolour of green, white and orange. Our names are more numerous amongst the nations of the world. Kathleen Ní Houlihan, the poor old woman, the little dark rose, and a little bit of heaven, an emerald set in the rising of the sea, the Queen of the West, the world's Cuishla Machrí, the greatest nation in the world is Ireland." So obviously as a representative of Ireland, I like in particular the last sentiment. But I think what struck me in that quote, and what strikes me about O'Casey and the play, is that he's speaking and really writing very much about the totality of experience of the Easter Rising. And there was, in the aftermath of the executions of the signatories of the proclamation, a sort of heroism that was associated with the Rising and everything with it. And that was part of the sort of official presentation within official Ireland as well of the Rising of the time. And O'Casey was sort of very early and very contemporary, really, in 1926 or in 1925, kind of investigating that and challenging that narrative and looking at the kind of ordinary people, if you like, who had played a part in the Rising and the impact that it had had on them. And in looking at this decade of centenaries from our kind of national perspective in Dublin and across Ireland, we have very much kind of looked to appreciate this totality of experience. But we're sort of 90 years behind O'Casey in doing that. My sense is he was really very, very much ahead of his time. And so it seems extremely fitting that it would be a centrepiece of the Abbey's contribution to the commemoration of the centenary.
Just one thing. I just wanted to, a bit of information. When Ronan talked about the riots around Plough, the Abbey holds the world record for riots in its own theatre. But this was the second occasion within 10 years, within 20 years, that there had been a riot. And what happened is the first night audience rioted at the play, at the portrayal of what they saw as often their fathers or their sons and brothers. And the founder of the Abbey, one of the founders of the Abbey, W.B. Yeats, leapt to the stage, and I'm going to ask you to do it because you did it so beautifully earlier, and spoke to the audience. And tell us what he said.
Well, you have disgraced yourselves again, I think was the line, and it was in reference to the reaction to Synge's the performance of Synge's play, A Playboy of the Western World, I think in 1907.
There had also been an uprising in the audience.
Yeah.
Indeed, yeah.
Although this one was more coordinated than the Synge one.
Yeah.
This one was organised by Cumann na Món, essentially, which was a women's nationalist movement of the time, and it was a lot of the widows of the heroes of 1916 who led that riot in the theatre that night, because while they bristled at the flags being brought into the pub in Act 2, it was Act 3 when Nora turns to the audience and says, "No, I looked into their eyes and they're afraid, they're afraid, they're afraid," when she was talking about the men who were out fighting in 1916. When she talked about their cowardice and calls them cowards, it was at that point that the women revolted.
But one of the actors who played one of the soldiers, Arthur Shields, was a member of the Abbey Company and walked out of our theatre, which is around the corner from the GPO, and participated in the Rising. So his voice for Cam was strong and was listened to, because he said, "Look, I was there and I stand by this play." He helped calm it down, and it went on to break all box office records. We have the original accounts from 1926. No play took as much at the box office as The Plough and the Stars did.
Yeah.
I'd like to shift gears.
Good publicity.
I'd like to shift gears just a little bit, Neil, since the Abbey has this incredible history of rioting. What are you going to do in your, Neil, I think you've officially been the artistic director for a week, but you've been there for quite a while.
8
Yeah,
days.
8 days.
8 days and counting.
Yes. So is there some
God
sort of...
created the world in less time.
The Abbey's a much harder job than the world. comes with more baggage.
Is there something you can say about what we can expect to see from you?
It's a massive privilege to take up the reins of the Abbey, and it is one of the great theatres of the world. There aren't that many theatres where you say a word, maybe Moscow Arts, National Theatre in London, maybe the Abbey. It's one of those great theatres, and it's built on a huge tradition. And Ireland has this huge tradition. Something that really, I tell this story a lot now, but when I visited after I was appointed. I'm a co-director. I'm coming as a double-headed monster with a Scottish guy called Graham McLaren, and you're lucky you haven't got him today. We were appointed in July 15 and started in July 16 as designate, and then officially took over just a few weeks ago. But I visited Dublin last October to come to the Dublin Theatre Festival. And the day I arrived on a Saturday morning, and the great Irish playwright Brian Friel, who wrote Dancing Lunacer, Philadelphia, Here I Come, The Faith Healer, one of the great writers of the 20th century and 21st century, had died the day before. And I bought the Irish Times to really just see, I'm sure there'll be something about the death of Brian Friel. Not only was there something, there was an 8-page obituary pullout, specially edited by Fintan O'Toole from the Irish Times. And it both thrilled and terrified me at the weight that Ireland places on its writers, especially its writers. And the Abbey is a writer's theatre. But I think moving forward, what you have to say, and I think everybody's spoken beautifully about the Plough. The Plough and the Stars was a revolutionary new play when it was written. All these great works that we love, they're new plays. When the first time an audience sees them, Shakespeare wrote new plays. And we threaten the future of theatre if we turn theatres into museums. And the Abbey hasn't done that. The Abbey's been careful not to do that, and we have to keep not doing that. And we have to treat classic plays as new plays when we present them, but we also have to absolutely encourage new plays and encourage writers to be making plays for the big stages of world theatre. So I really hope that the Abbey moving forward will do. I think we'll do 3 things slightly differently than over the last few years. I think we will be encouraging new writing for the main stage at the Abbey. It isn't so big as to be a terrifying space. It's only 500 seats, the Abbey. It's, in a sense, its reputation is bigger than its space. So there has to be a place for radical new work, I think, on the Abbey main stage. Secondly, there's a massive amount of theatrical and indeed cross-art talent in Ireland, which hasn't always had a chance to be seen at the Abbey. So we want the Abbey to be a more open space, to invite other companies, both Irish and international, and hopefully from the US, to visit the Abbey and play at the Abbey, presented as part of the Abbey program on a level playing field with the Abbey. And thirdly, we want the Abbey to get out of Dublin more. I don't know if anybody here has ever been to the Abbey Theatre. Has anybody? A couple. Okay. The first time I went to the Abbey Theatre, I went on a kind of pilgrimage about 25 years ago to go to the Abbey. And without being really mean to my new employee, it was one of the most disappointing experiences of my life, because the Abbey Theatre itself is a 1960s breeze block brutalism building. But it's the address that's important. It's on Abbey Street. That's what people love. The building itself is actually... The auditorium is great, but the building itself is a little dysfunctional to work in at times. And, it's the third building on that site. So it isn't the building itself isn't what makes the Abbey the National Theatre. It's what happens within it and the artists who make the National Theatre. So what we really want to do is to encourage the Abbey to make work outside of Dublin in Ireland, and maybe not even show that show in Dublin. Perhaps it'll be made in Galway or in Belfast or in Cork or other places. And also, what's been fantastic about this year is that the Plough and the Stars has been on a US tour, which we're thrilled to be concluding here in this beautiful city of Columbus. And we've also had another show in New York this year called Quietly, which played at the Irish Repertory Theatre in New York. And it's been fantastic. It's been a real shot in the arm for the Abbey to be out on the road internationally. So I think what we'll see more, I hope, is the Abbey making work in Ireland outside of Dublin, and indeed exporting work all across the world, and including the United States.
Yeah. In a few minutes, we'll move to the audience questions, but let me ask, are there any other touring opportunities coming up after the Plough and the Stars? I mean, things that are concretely set and
You're
ready to
you're
go.
trying to get me to tell you what we're doing.
I
next
am.
year, and
People do it to me all the time, and
we haven't announced the program. We announced
tables.
the program in November, so I genuinely can't do it. There's people with cameras and phones, and it'll be all over.
They put them all away.
It'll be all over Twitter. We encourage you to tweet. Abbey just announced their program in Columbus. So I'm not going to tell. No, but there are definitely things that we are working on that we hope to have a very regular presence in the United States, and we would certainly want to be revisiting Columbus as well. That's all I'm going to say. It was a good effort, though.
Thank you. Well, I think that we were talking at lunch. I think the CATCO will be hosting a trip to Dublin to see what Neil's doing, so watch for that.
Hope so.
We're ready to. I have this spontaneous statement I'm going to make about it is CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Please state your name, ask your question, and we thank you in advance for not making long editorial comments. Let's proceed with the first question.
Hi, Andy Campbell. Happy to break the ice and ask the first question. So you've been touring the States here for some months, and I wonder if you could share some of the experiences you've had on the road, some of the reactions you've had from the audience in the various cities you've been to.
Generally speaking, the response has been very warm to the production. I think the construct of the production itself is to be provocative. Is that, I mean, not for the sake of it, but rather to try and tap into the spirit of the play when it was new, and the sense of danger that it brought to the theatre. So I think that there have been some challenges in terms, as I was talking earlier on, in terms of the aesthetic of the show. That I think that sometimes people want to know what they're getting, and they're like, "Hey, I want to go and see the Abbey Theatre from a play that's based 90 years ago, that's written by Sean O'Casey. Where are the shawls?" So I think that initially that can be a bit of a gut reaction. It's like, oh, this is not what I thought it was going to be. But that to me is a very exciting moment when the curtain goes up and you're not quite sure where you are, and it makes you lean forward and open your ears and engage with what it is that we're trying to do. And I believe for the large part of the audiences have done just that. I think that they have really gone along for the ride, you know.
I've loved talking to people who, before the show, have been very much like that and have an expectation. And often maybe they're people who act themselves or have seen different productions or know the play very well. And to sort of get their personal reviews afterwards, coming up, talking about things they saw, they didn't see before, things they enjoyed, how clear it was, and just people's willingness to come and tell us what they think afterwards has been brilliant.
Yeah.
Can't really add to it because I haven't been in any of the productions.
I mean, I would just say, in terms of being the incoming director, you know, there was a slight, the Abbey Theatre and the Plough and the Stars in America, and had it been the Shaw's production, as Ronan described, that would have been a tough precursor to I suppose, a new regime. What's thrilling about this Plough is that, exactly as I think Ronan described earlier, I think Sean and Ronan, who's done an amazing job looking after this show and keeping it fresh, treat it like it's a new piece of writing. So it doesn't feel, it feels absolutely fresh. And I mean, I find it incredibly moving, I have to say. And I've seen it in 3 or 4 places on the tour. What happens, I think, is as Ronan says, I think the first 10 minutes, the audience is slightly, what world are we in here? What world? But by the time you get to the end, everybody, you know exactly what world you're in. You know you're in 1916, but you also know you're in every kind of conflict and every kind of civil conflict that's happening both now, indeed it feels incredibly contemporaneous. So it's been a really moving experience. There are some good seats still available. There are 5 performances here. So I really hope you will all come and see it, and we would love to talk to you about it afterwards as well.
There's a question at the mic.
Hi, my name is Dan Dennis. I'm artistic director of Tantrum Theatre, which is a new company based in Dublin, Ohio. It's a suburb of Columbus, not too far away. We were happy to have our very first season this last summer. We did Dancing at Luna, so we were really pleased to mark Brian Friel's passing in that way, and look forward to doing more Irish work in the future. So I really want to thank you for being here, first of all, and for speaking as eloquently as you have about why this play, why you're doing it. And I wanted to ask about the idea of the cultural export, that this is what you've chosen to tour and to the United States, and thinking about, as you were speaking about the intervening time that has passed, 1916 to 2016, and how what's happening in the world now affects the lens through which you are presenting this and that we're looking at the piece with. So I'm thinking about, of course, here, it's all we can think about is the election that's coming up, about Brexit, not that that's directly affecting you, but certainly, coming from Scotland, Mr. Murray, there are interesting things happening that give us a way of thinking about the death of a socialist Ireland. So if you could just speak to that a little bit.
I think in terms, I'm not sure that contemporary parallels were actively pursued in terms of the American election, or indeed conflict that's going on around the world, like Syria, or because images within the play suggest those sort of things to you, and because uniforms, especially military uniforms, are contemporary ones, and so all of the connections resonate. I think that the context that we were more actively pursuing in terms of contemporary, finding a contemporary language for it was, as I was saying earlier on, poverty. And because a lot of the ideas within the play, or people's the fundamentalism of people's connection to those ideas and what they're willing to do for them, whether that's socialism or nationalism, the idea of a free Ireland, whether that fundamentalism is alcohol or your husband, because people are they have invested so much energy in these ideas, and they're willing to sacrifice their lives for them, because the overarching context, I think, is one of extreme poverty. I mean, it is even very difficult in terms of the aesthetic now to truly reference how horrific these people's lives were, as in their day-to-day lives, how difficult it was. And I think that the struggle largely within the play is for identity and purpose. And I think that, the play opens and somebody is already standing on all of their necks already. Do you know what I mean? They have very little to lose, and they are constantly searching both within themselves and fighting with everybody around them to try and find room to exist. So really we were trying to find that sort of context, because the internal conflict within the play is really about people's lack of agency, their lack of ability to change the world in which they live, and the overarching sense that they are being extinguished.
But I think your point about you mentioned cultural export as well, and I think one of the things that's a great thrill for when you bring a play out on tour is, I think, the truly great plays speak to people wherever they are, whatever the country. There's something in a great play that you recognise, that you identify with, that makes you think about what's going on now. And this year for the Abbey, to have Plough touring in the States, but also to have had Quietly in New York for 2 months in the summer, which is a brand new play that premiered at the Abbey in 2012, and for the conversation around that to be how much that's a play about reconciliation and forgiveness, and for people to identify so strongly with that right now in the States struck me. And I guess, we're fortunate to have had the opportunity to take these two plays out on the road this year.
I might just speak a little bit, kind of not necessarily specific or singularly specific to the play, but about the commemorations in the US and the connection between 1916 and the US more generally, and then also to the UK. Something I was interested to know, actually, Sean O'Casey had travelled out to the US quite a bit, and I think got to be friendly with Eugene O'Neill, amongst other American playwrights while out here. But as far as the declaration or the proclamation of independence in Ireland is concerned, it was very heavily modelled on your own Declaration of Independence. So the authors drew inspiration from the US example. And I think 5 of the 7 signatories had spent considerable periods of time in the US. 1 was an American citizen. And the proclamation itself, actually, the United States is the only country, other than Ireland, specifically mentioned in it. And it speaks of sort of our children effectively in the US. So prospectively, some of your ancestors perhaps in this room today. So there was a very strong and very natural connection between Ireland and the United States at that time, and it's continued right through to today. And it was one of the reasons why, in looking at our commemoration of 1916 and indeed of this decade of centenaries more generally, there was such an emphasis in our international programme on the United States. And this play is a real highlight, but it's one of many hundreds of events which have taken place across the country here, indeed many in Ohio as well. The other thing, prior to coming here, and I'm not much longer in the job than you are, just 12 weeks in Chicago, in Illinois, I was working in our Department of the Taoiseach, our Prime Minister's office in the EU division there, and most centrally concerned with Brexit, which was a very difficult and challenging role to be in and has very profound implications for Ireland. But one of the things which I thought was interesting, and the play is obviously, its context is the relationship between Ireland and Britain to some extent. How positive the relationship has been between Ireland and the UK over the last 15, 20 years in particular, and how strong and connected the two countries are. And I mean, that was brought home to a very considerable extent by the state visit, first of Queen Elizabeth, the first state visit to Ireland in 2011, and then a reciprocal visit from our president to the United Kingdom as a state visit in 2014. And artists were very integrally involved in both visits. And I think it kind of comes back to the point you're making, Neil, about how centrally we hold artists, the esteem Irish people hold them in. And as a diplomat, I probably shouldn't be saying it, but I've always felt artists and writers in particular are probably our best ambassadors in very, very many senses. And I should say, my mother is a writer, so I have a special reason to say that also.
And just to close off this, but I mean, Oonagh, I think, completely nailed it when I think you say, those great works of art, without having to force it, raise issues that you can't help but watch the Plough and your eye goes to a television image you've seen from somewhere else, and indeed those political divisions as well. I'll go off script very briefly and just reference Brexit as somebody who's just left Scotland after 25 years, where, I mean, Brexit is causing a huge issue in the United Kingdom. I mean, for those of you who don't know, Scotland voted 62-38 to remain in the EU, having narrowly lost a referendum 55-45 to become independent on the basis that a lot of people voted to remain in the UK so they would stay in the EU. So they've been shafted both ways, as one could argue. So I think that's what happens in Scotland is it's interesting. 100 years after the Easter Rising in Ireland, I sense a Glasgow Rising coming, and you don't want to be in the way of that.
Mary.
My name is Mary Urena. In the interest of full disclosure, I'm vice president of the CATCO board, as well as I live in Dublin, Ohio. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and ask you, and really reference to somewhat of what was just shared, but also Mr. Murray's previous comment about it being a writers-based national treasure, global treasure theater. I think that's one of the things that all cultural institutions struggle with in communities is how do we come so ingrained in our communities that they don't want to see us fail, and how do we promote that to the next generation to continue it forward. So I'm curious what the Abbey does to maintain its status with both current generations and future generations, planning for those future generations to maintain its status as a national cultural treasure.
So we had one of the things we did with support from the government this year as part of our 2016 programme was there is a new play called Me Malzer, written by Ali White, which takes the character of Malzer, played by Rachel in The Plough and the Stars, and tells her story. And that is designed for students between the ages of 10 and 12. So this year we performed that to groups of 30 to 40 kids at a time, so the size of one class in schools and libraries and church halls all around Ireland. So 18,000 students saw that in Ireland this year, aged between 10 and 12. For many of them, it was their first time they've experienced live theatre. So they got that up close and personal in a room with their 30 classmates, 2 actors performing their national theatre, performing for them where they live. There was work around that, around theatre, producing, the themes of the play, the themes of 1916 that are being discussed all around Ireland. We were then very fortunate to be able to bring that to Boston and Philadelphia earlier this month and perform with them in their library network. So again, the power of theatre, telling a story about a certain time in history, the chance to do that for diverse communities here, for kids of different backgrounds. So that's a large-scale example of what we've done this year. We work very closely then with our local secondary school, bringing kids in, trying to make sure they feel it's as much their Abbey Theatre as anybody else's. And one of the exciting things about Neil and Graham coming in is they have huge experience in making work in communities, about the community, for the community, with the best theatre artists and theatre makers in any country. So personally, I'm excited to see what we do there as well.
But I think it's a great question, and I think it's the challenge. And I think, you know, way too often, I don't want to sit here glibly, you know, the Abbey has got a massive job to do. And I think one of our big challenges, as I spoke earlier, is about making sure that we're developing new plays, that we're not afraid to fail. As the great Sam Beckett said, try again, fail better. If, you know, we have to have that right to fail. We have to be bold enough to put work on that might not always work. I mean, you know...
More riots.
More riots. Now, you know, but way too often I sit in theatres all around the world where I'm one of the younger people in the audience, and that's just wrong. That's wrong now. I should not be, you know, I need to be one of the older people in that theatre. And that's the really big challenge, not just for the Abbey, I think for theatre, as it fights for its place in a kind of a global entertainment world now, which is very, very different from when O'Casey wrote The Plough and the Stars, for example. Yeah. I think it's the challenge, is how do we make theatre exciting and accessible without forcing young people to come to it? How do we develop work that speaks to them? How do we make the theatres themselves places that don't intimidate people? Yeah. That thought of opening those big heavy doors and walking into a darkened auditorium in a plush red seat where you're shouted at to turn your phone off as soon as you get in there. You know, we have to acknowledge these things whilst preserving the art form and as pure as we can. We've also got to bend a little, I think, and that's a really big challenge. And it's up to all of us who work in theatre to do that. But we have to do it because I think the warning signs are there in terms of certainly in Britain and Ireland, the demographic of the theatre audience is getting older, and that needs to reverse.
And it's about celebrating the trump card that theatre has, really, isn't it? Which is that it's live in the room with you. Yeah. I mean, if that is not first and foremost, like the centre of every production that you're making, well, then you're in the wrong medium. You know, well, this is my personal taste, but I find it very challenging now if I'm sitting in a room and there are other people breathing the same oxygen as me and they're acting like there's like a glass wall between us. I start to slightly question my own sanity because, you know, rather than come out and talk to me, that man has just exclaimed something to the leg of that chair, and I'm not really sure why that's happened, and I don't really know why he's not taking advantage of the fact that I exist and I'm here with him and I'm looking to connect with him. Because the thing about theatre is, or any sort of live performance, is that it has a directness which supersedes any other medium, and so it requires more of us. I think it's part of the reason why, you know, theatre can be more challenging to kind of turn up to, is because you know you don't get to fast forward or switch channel or turn off. It requires you to be present. And in an age where we are so saturated by various forms of media from every side, it is going to become something that we really need to that needs to be celebrated. It's a communal ritual which reminds us all that we're all in it together, and so, you know, stronger together, etc. You know, and so it's a political gesture as well. So, you know, yes, it's just where am I going with this? Its liveness is important, and it's the trump card to play.
Yeah, this is where I can help by stepping in and
Thank
interrupting.
God.
You're very welcome, Ronan. So what place does social media have in what we do? I mean, what?
Well, it has a huge role in selling it, for a start. You know, the days of the everybody waiting for the first review the next morning, nervously rushing out to buy a newspaper. Well, that's gone. You know, it's on Twitter before the applause is finished. So we have to channel social media in terms of marketing and selling our work. I mean, more and more shows. I've been at a number of pieces recently where you're encouraged to keep your phone on and tweet during it, and so I mean I don't necessarily want to do that, and I don't want to see people around me with phones on. I think it's just about one size doesn't fit all. I think you've just got there are certain nights, and as Ronan's just described so brilliantly, even if it's if it's a wonderful, well-made, old-fashioned play, it still has to speak to the audience. Yeah. So that doesn't mean everybody has to be tweeting about it, but I think there are ways where social media and particularly I think in how we sell and market and spread the word of theatre, I think has a huge role to play.
It grieves me that it's time for us to stop. Thank you all. I think you...
I hope you all enjoyed today's forum. We encourage you to come back and also to have added conversation with our cookies in the back and coffee. You can view and share today's forum and all of our forums on CTV, Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio channel, and anytime on CMC's website via YouTube. Our sponsors, Carol McGuire Legacy Fund, OSU Urban Art Space, and GCAC, thank you. And our partner, CAPA, thank you very much. And of course, our speakers, Neil Murray, Ronan Phelan, Ragnar Almquist, Oonagh Desire, and Stephen Anderson. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. We look forward to seeing you next week. Oh, thank you.